I want you to think about a meal that you will never forget. A meal that you will never forget. I can think of a few in my life for different reasons. The first, I think about the first date I had with Reagan and pulling up to dinner that night at the gas station. And before I get funny messages and stuff, I'm being serious. I grew up Tarrant County side of things, and over in Watauga, if you know Tarrant County and Watauga, there's this gas station that long before it was featured on Food Network, it housed a fine dining restaurant in half of it called Chef Point Cafe. Now, it was featured on Guy Fieri's show and on several other shows since then, so now it looks more like a restaurant. But back when we went there, it looked like a Conoco gas station. And Reagan was shooting me some looks like, what are we doing here? And we sat down and had one of the best meals of my life, this blackened chicken stuffed Asiago cheese with this cream sauce on pasta. It was like 8,000 calories and worth every bite. I remember that meal because it was so delicious, but also because of who it was with. I mean, Reagan and I, we were so nervous going into that first date. Both of us trying to play it really cool because we were really into each other. And by the end of dinner, we had begun discussing how many kids we hoped to have one day. So, we kept it really chill, right? I'll never forget that meal. I'll also always remember chili cheese dog po' boy in New Orleans. This wasn't my meal. This was my little brother Jake's meal. He's 9 years younger than me. I was a teenager at the time, and we were about to get on a plane and go back home to Dallas when we stopped for a po' boy for lunch in New Orleans, and he got the chili cheese dog po' boy, and it looked about like how it imagines, except I don't remember the meal going in. I remember it coming out on the plane a few hours later as I was flying alone with my little brother, and so I was the responsible party. That was a fun story to tell my mom as she saw us walking down the hallway in the airport, me wearing my undershirt, but not the other shirt I had been wearing, Jake wearing that shirt, and also a Southwest Airlines blanket as a toga. I will never forget that meal. I'll also never forget the barbecue that my family loves to eat in Kansas City when we get to travel there. Reagan's family is in Kansas City now. She grew up in Kansas, and Salina and her parents and brother and his family live in Kansas City now. So we're rooting for the Chiefs tonight, like I assume every other God-fearing Christian is, because if you root for Tom Brady, then I think you made a deal with the devil. That's neither here nor there. But when we go to Kansas City, I love to eat their barbecue, and hear me out, as a Texan, I will admit they should take brisket off the menu. It's absolute trash. But their ribs, their pork ribs are so good. The first time I went there for an entire week, I ate nothing but barbecue for every meal, I'm pretty sure. And I'm also pretty sure I didn't go number 2 for a month. But it was so good. I still get the meat sweats just thinking about those ribs. Not just the ribs, but the family that we get to share that meal around a table with. The family we haven't gotten to be in the same room with for over a year now, like many of you. These are meals that I won't forget for very many different reasons. There's an unforgettable meal in the Gospels as well. In fact, it's so unforgettable that out of all 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, other than Jesus' last week of life, what we call the Passion narrative, when he shows up to Jerusalem until he's crucified that final week, outside of that week, there is only one story that is featured in every single gospel. And it's a meal, an unforgettable meal, a meal for 5,000 people, give or take. A meal that left such an impact that every gospel writer had to include it in their story. It was so central to understanding who Jesus was and what Jesus came to do that it made its way into every story, and no other story can hold that acclaim. What does that tell us? Well, first, it tells us that it's a story worth paying attention to. If it made that kind of an impact, we ought to draw in close and look deeply at what's happening here. And secondly, it's interesting because every gospel author has a different take. Just like when your friends each tell their version of a story that happened that they all experienced. Everyone's got their own little twist, and John is no different. He's got his own take that we're going to look at today as we continue in this series called A Generous Life. Today is our last week in this sermon series where we've been looking at our call to greater generosity both as individuals and as a collective community. And today we're going to look at John's telling of this memorable meal And the things that are revealed to him and to us through this story, three things that I think are revealed through this story that are helpful for us this week as we continue on this path of discipleship towards greater generosity. The first thing the story reveals to us is this. It reveals who we are and who Jesus is not. Sometimes it's helpful to know who Jesus is not before we can know who Jesus is. It reveals who we are and who Jesus is not, and primarily through the eyes and actions of everyone around Jesus in this story, the disciples and the crowd. Let me say more. So the disciples that are there, I love the disciples. In all the Gospels, the disciples never get it, right? They're always cast as these sort of schmucks that are always like halfway onto who Jesus is. And keep in mind, he has just performed these healing miracles, so they ought to be onto him by now. But alas, they're not. And I can really identify with Philip. Did you hear what he said when Jesus said, hey, we got to feed these people? You know, because Jesus knows something about church work, and that is when you're going to gather this many people together in a space, you'd better have a plan to feed them, right? And so he says, let's feed these people. Let's feed this crowd gathered here. And Philip's reaction is honestly my reaction. Who are the realists in the room? You can type, that's me, or point to your friend that's watching with you this morning. Philip says, Jesus, more than half a year's salary. More than half a year's salary. Look what I got. He says, I got this. How are we going to pay for this food? Half a year's salary wouldn't pay for a bite for every single person. How is this going to be possible? And then Andrew, I love Andrew. He tries to be a bit of an optimist, but he doesn't commit to it, right? He sees this boy that's brought up 5 loaves and 2 fishes, and he says, here's this kid that has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but you know, what good is that to a crowd like this, right? Like he's like, well, I did my job, but I don't know if that's going to do any good, right? So thanks, Andrew, for that. You know, it impresses upon me how so often we can see the meal that Jesus has set before us and we see it as so meager. How many times in my life do I see what's before me as so much smaller than Jesus wants me to see it as? And even more than that, so often I can be like Philip and Andrew where I see problems as looming so much larger than possibilities in my life. I fixate on what's not possible, on what can't be done, rather than considering what could be possible if I open up my perception. The crowd is the other sort of character in this story. And we didn't hear it in the scripture reading a moment ago, but the end of the story goes like this. When the people saw that Jesus had done this miraculous sign, they said, this is truly the prophet who is coming into the world. And Jesus understood what they were about, that they were about to come and force him to be their king. So he took refuge again, alone on the mountain. What does this mean? So to understand what's happening here, we have to understand the context of the story. It's taking place during Passover. Remember, it mentions that it's happening during Passover. And in fact, Jesus is sort of characterized as the host of a Passover meal in John's gospel. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But the crowd, it comes from a Jewish tradition, right? And if you're someone from a Jewish tradition, Passover is a very meaningful moment. It's connected to that original Passover from the story of Moses, that book of Exodus, when it's the sort of climactic ending as Moses is leading the people. It's what's going to create that moment for Moses to lead the people out of oppression and into liberation from under Egypt's thumb. And so if you're a Jewish tradition person sitting in the crowd in Jesus' day, and it's Passover, and here's this miracle worker, and he's performing miracles at Passover, and you're living as an oppressed people in an oppressive land with a regime to be overthrown, what are you thinking? Here we go. It's time for Exodus part 2. Here's our king. He's going to lead us to liberation. He's going to lead us to military conquest and victory. We're going to be our own people again, out from underneath Rome's empire. But Jesus knows that he is more than their king. Both those words. He's more than theirs. And he's more than simply an earthly king. You know, maybe some of the people in the crowd interpreted king a little differently. Maybe they just thought, hey, here's a guy who's going to keep us well fed. Like a king keeps his subjects well fed. Here's a guy that's going to take care of our every desire and every need. And while it might sound nice to have a one-way street relationship with God where God just gives us all that we want all of the time, John is not preaching the prosperity gospel. Because that doesn't create the kind of renewal that Jesus is after. Jesus wants more than an earthly king relationship with us. He wants to be more than just ours, some of ours. He wants to be all of ours. So the first thing the story reveals, it reveals who we are and who Jesus is not. We tend to see meals as meager, Jesus as merely a means to power, and problems looming larger than possibility. We tend to see meals as meager. What God has before us is so big and we can see it as so small. We see Jesus as merely a means to power. How can Jesus improve my life and make my status better? How is he a means to my ends? We see problems looming larger than possibility. Jesus, I see a crowd out before us and I can't imagine how we're going to feed them. Yeah, I know you just healed a bunch of people, but I don't know how this is possible. The second thing this story reveals to us is it reveals who Jesus is. It reveals who Jesus is in a profound way. You know, Jesus knows what he's here to do. It mentions that he tests the disciples. He's testing them. Now, I don't think that God tests us in like a malicious way. I think this is more of a way of sharing that Jesus knows exactly what he's about and what he's there to accomplish. And I love this little image, this scene where it says this in the text. It says that Jesus distributed the food to those who were sitting there. Now maybe I'm reading a little too much into it for a moment, but it mentions later that he sends the disciples out to gather up the scraps, right? But it doesn't mention that he sends them out to serve. It says that he goes and distributes the food. I'm imagining Jesus going up to each of the 5,000 households gathered there and serving every one of them. How much bread do you need? Take some more. Do you want some more fish? Make sure you're full. That this personal, intimate relationship with Jesus that is being pictured here by John. You know, this story for John opens up a larger chapter where Jesus will tell the crowd that he is the bread of life. He's going to connect this personal connection moment to the theology of who he is. Saying, I am this bread of life. I am this nourishment that you just received. That personal work, it's about more than just your bellies. It's happening deep within your souls. You know, John's gospel, his version of the story is so uniquely Christological, which basically means it reveals the true nature of Jesus' nature. It reveals something core about who Jesus is. And who Jesus is, according to John, is someone that nourishes us in a way that nothing and no one else can. And Jesus is also someone that produces abundance from sacrifice. These 5 loaves and 2 fishes that Andrew and Philip couldn't possibly imagine feeding a crowd, suddenly they're carrying baskets to take in the extra. I want to say a word about that for a moment. On the subject of generosity, you know, there have been times in my life where I was not able to give as much as I wished I could. And maybe there were times in my life that I wasn't able to give anything at all. I think about like fresh out of college and riddled with debt. I think about going to grad school or maybe after Andy was born and paying off hospital bills. You know, there are times when you wish you could put more zeros down, right? Or you feel like, I'm not giving enough. And that shame and that guilt can begin to take over. And yet I know that shame and that guilt is not born of the gospel and it's not born of Jesus, because even the smallest sacrifice, if it's made meaningfully, Jesus can do something incredible with that. It impresses upon me that it's not about the amount that we give, not about the amount that we offer up. It's about how meaningful that sacrifice is to us. That's why in this Generous Life series, we've talked about praying the prayer, God, where do you want me to be in my giving? Because once that answer is found, once that peace is found, we can trust, even if what we feel like we're offering is 5 loaves and a couple of fish, what can Jesus do with that in his hands? What can Jesus do with our gifts here at Arapahoe and in our larger community? We may see something small, but Jesus says, if it's meaningful, I'm going to turn this into abundance. Not for us personally, but for our larger world. I need to hear that truth this Sunday. Do you? So the second thing this story does is it reveals who Jesus is. Jesus turns meaningful sacrifice, no matter how small, into abundance. Meaningful sacrifice into abundance. But John's not just talking about who Jesus is. The last thing this story reveals is who we can be. Because it's not enough for us to simply see Jesus and go, wow, he's incredible. I wish I could be like that. Jesus says, no, we get to be like that. We're invited into this Jesus life. Notice the end. I love the end of this story when Jesus sends the disciples out, the same ones who said, oh my gosh, how are we ever going to pull this off? All we've got is 5 loaves and 2 fish. He sends them out with baskets to go and collect all the scraps. Now, there's 12 baskets, and I'm going to let the Bible scholars debate and argue over the symbology of 12. But here's an idea. Maybe it's because there's 12 disciples, right? And every one of the disciples had to go out holding a basket. These same disciples that mumbled and grumbled about how this isn't going to work. And they had to go to each of these families, each of these people, and collect all the abundant scraps of bread. Notice they're not collecting scraps of fish because that's gross and doesn't keep well on the road. But they're going to collect all these scraps of bread. And they're going to see the impact of this meal in the faces of those gathered there. Going to see the joy that comes with a full belly and full conversation amongst family and friends. They're going to feel the weight of the abundance in their hands and bring it back to Christ, as though Christ is saying, you get to be a part of this abundant life as well. You get to take this basket out into the world. Imagine what this could become. Imagine what this could become in my spirit, in my grace. We are invited into that same kind of life. We are called in the same path as the disciples, in the same footsteps of Jesus, to carry our baskets, to hold our hands ready to receive, and yet also ready to give. This is what it means to be a disciple of Jesus in the echoes of this story this morning. When we make Christ's hands our own, when we hold our hands in the form of a basket, ready to receive and ready to give, we get to witness with our own eyes and feel with our own hands how even the smallest scraps that we or our world may have to offer can become abundance and grace and mercy and love when our hands adopt the same shape as Christ's. So today I want to close reading a poem. I'm not a poet, but I like poetry. And I found a poem by a woman named Jan Richardson. She's a poet and author. And I also found out she is a United Methodist pastor, which is really cool. And she wrote this poem called Blessing the Fragments that I want to share with you now, and you'll see it on your screens. I invite you to hold your hands ready to receive and ready to give as you hear these words, and maybe even read them along with me. Cup your hands together, she says, and you will see the shape this blessing wants to take. Basket, bowl, vessel. It cannot help but hold itself open to welcome what comes. This blessing knows the secret of the fragments that find their way into its keeping. The wholeness that may hide in what has been left behind. The persistence of plenty where there seemed only lack. Look into the hollows of your hands and ask what wants to be gathered there. What abundance waits among the scraps that come to you? What feast will offer itself from the fragments that remain? And let God's people say, amen. For the last 4 weeks, we have been engaged in this series called A Generous Life. And it's more than just a sermon series. It's actually a 4-week journey that we've been about as the people in place called Arapahoe that will be concluding this upcoming week. Hopefully in your inbox this morning, you'll receive the last 7 installments of a 28-day devotional that we've been working through called A Generous Life as well. And as we arrive at the end of this journey together, I want to share a few things with you this morning. First of all, if you're just joining us, generosity at Arapahoe is not about funding a budget. Ultimately, it is about prayerfully considering where God wants us to be in our giving as a spiritual discipline in the life of discipleship as we follow after Jesus. As we look to what God is dreaming to do through our ministries together here at Arapahoe in 2021, we as the people in place called Arapahoe, who call Arapahoe our home, are engaging in this prayerful discernment work, praying a common prayer. God, where do you want me to be in my giving? Now, I want to acknowledge that some of us have faced challenges this past year. I watch the news just like you do, and I also receive messages from members who are dealing with unemployment or medical issues and medical bills piling up or other challenges over these last 12 months. And I've even received messages from people saying, I don't know that I'm in a position that I can give right now, and I just need you to know that and to pray for me as a pastor here at Arapahoe. And I'm so grateful for that level of authenticity and honesty, and I hope to foster that in our culture here because I do recognize that not every year is the same, and some of us have every desire to give, and then some years that's just simply not possible. But for many of us, your family is probably like mine, and we haven't faced the kind of challenges that so many others have, and we are in a position to give, and we're actually in a position to try to take those next faithful steps in our giving. And for all of us who are in a position to give and are praying that prayer, God, where do you want me to be in my giving? I want to show you the giving path. This is a tool that we use here at Arapahoe to help level the playing field in a way. And it's a way for us to see that no matter where we are in our giving, there are steps that we can take to continue in this road towards greater generosity that all of us participate in. Maybe you've never given before, and you're feeling inspired to give for the first time to the ministries here. I want to encourage you in that. That would be phenomenal. Maybe you're ready to give on a regular basis. You've given off and on, but you want to make it a regular part of your discipleship life. Maybe it's time to begin what we call percentage giving, and that's when you set aside a percentage of your income on your way towards a tithe, and each year you increase that percentage until you reach that level of tithe or that 10% set aside for God's work in the church. And maybe you do tithe. My family's been on that journey towards tithing the last several years. Maybe you're tithing and it's time to take that next step towards what we call extravagant generosity, giving above and beyond a tithe. Wherever you are on the giving path, wherever you are in the state of your financial life this year, I hope that we can all pray the prayer, God, where do you want me to be in my giving? And to trust that it's not the amount, but it's that taking that next faithful step and that meaningful sacrifice, and God will provide for God's church in the end. This week, you're going to receive a card called an Estimate of Giving card. I'm going to show it to you now. It looks like this. It's got a couple sides to it. You're going to receive this both in the mail and online. I want to say a couple words about it. First of all, what it's called an Estimate of Giving card, and that's exactly what it is. This is not a commitment card or a pledge card. This is simply a way for you to let us know what you expect and anticipate to be able to give this upcoming year. So I don't want you to feel like you're signing a contract or anything like that. This is just a helpful way to let us know the kind of resources we can expect so we can be good stewards at Arapahoe. You'll notice the first box you can check says, yes, I will pray for the mission and ministry of Arapahoe United Methodist Church. I hope that we can all turn in this card and check that box. Regardless of what the rest of this card says, I hope that we can all at least offer our prayers to our church. And then the rest you'll see, and it's fairly self-explanatory. You can list out your estimate of giving by week or by month or by year. And you can also sign up for recurring giving if you choose to do so. That's a really helpful way to give here at Arapahoe. It gives us a wonderful base of support throughout the year. Now, we'll be following up on this. You can turn it in both through the mail and also online. There's an online form. That's really easy. That's the way that I like to fill it out personally. And you'll be receiving that later this week, both in the mail and through email. And we'll begin following up next week and the weeks to come. And our hope is that everybody can participate. Regardless the number that you choose to put down. If you check that box and you have to put down 0 for the amount that you can estimate to give this year, we hope that everybody can still fill this out because this is something that we believe is a part of the discipleship journey here at Arapahoe for all of us who call this place home. And once we receive a card from you, then you know that the follow-up will stop. My pesky, persistent self will stop showing up in your inbox, right? Amen. So I want to say thank you for your generosity that has been expressed over this last year and for the generosity to come. I want you to know that I am here for you as your pastor. If you need to reach out and let me know what's happening in your life and how I can pray for you and encourage you, I want to be that for you in your life. I hope that we can be that kind of a church together. And I'm excited to see what God will do through all of us as we continue to grow in generosity together here at Arapahoe. If you would like to give this Sunday, there are 3 easy ways to give. You can give by going online to arapahoeumc.org/donate. You can give by going to by texting the word "give" to the number you see on your screen now. And lastly, you can give by mailing a check to 1400 West Arapahoe Road, Richardson, Texas 75080. Thank you for your gifts. Thank you for participating in a generous life this year, and I look forward to sharing good news with you in the weeks to come.